This week, world leaders will gather in Dubai for the beginning of the COP28 climate summit. The stakes could hardly be higher after a year in which yet more climate records were broken. This year's event has already attracted controversy before it's even begun, with the chief executive of a state-run oil firm acting as COP28 President. So, what can we expect over the coming weeks, and what might reasonably constitute a successful COP? To discuss the summit, we gathered the thoughts of Adam Vaughan, environment editor of The Times, and Tessa Khan, an international climate lawyer. This year's COP summit is being held in Dubai, so that's not without controversy.
Yeah, it's certainly been a contentious choice. It's the world's seventh biggest oil producer, and the president of the talks, the person who chairs it, is Dr. Sultan Al Jaber. And not only is he chairing the talks, but he is continuing his roles as chief of the state oil company ADNOC and the renewable energy company there, Masdar, as well. So he's certainly coming for, he's certainly coming for his fair share of criticism.
So it begs the question, why?
So, advocates would say that you have to have, all countries on board if you're going to get a global deal on climate change, and that, his team would argue that he brings something to the table in terms of bringing oil and gas companies together. That's one of the things they're hoping to do at the summit, as a side deal on oil and gas firms cutting their emissions. And, people like the UN climate chief, Simon Steele, defend it on the grounds that he's a kind of bridge between different countries. On the other hand, we've seen this week, talking points prepared for him by his officials, where the UAE has been sort of out meeting countries ahead of COP28, and he was told by his officials to sort of effectively plan oil and gas deals on the sidelines of these meetings. I think ultimately it's all going to be judged by the outcome of the summit, right, John?
Okay. And Tessa, there was much interest in the UK, Scotland in particular, for COP26 when it was here in Glasgow. We're now 2 summits down the line. What's expected from this one? What do you want to see?
Well, I think, there are 2 major ambitions for this summit, and really these are critical to ensuring that, globally governments deliver on that promise to hold warming to below 1.5 degrees ideally, and certainly well below 2 degrees of warming. We've just lived through the hottest year on record. We've seen really extreme, warming within our oceans, as well as unprecedented wildfires, heat waves, flooding and so on just in recent months. So I think there's a real sense of urgency that we've got to grasp the root of this problem, which is the level of greenhouse gas emissions that are being produced globally. And the key to cutting those, of course, is to cutting consumption and production of fossil fuels. So that is a really key issue. The other key issue is this question of whether or not rich countries will do enough to support developing countries who are really at the front lines of the climate crisis in terms of the impact, with financing the losses that they're currently experiencing. So those are the 2 major issues on the table.
And Tessa, we heard much the same before COP26 in the UK and Scotland. What's actually changed since then? Is anything different?
It's a good question. On the financing issue, what we had last year at COP27 was basically an agreement to create a facility to collect money that would then go to those developing countries to support them with the damage that they're already incurring as a result of climate change. There's been a step forward. The question is now whether or not we can get enough money into that fund for it to be meaningful. On the question of, whether or not we're going to phase out fossil fuels at the pace and scale required, we are pretty much where we were in Glasgow, in that there is a fight around whether or not to include all fossil fuels, not just coal, but oil and gas as well. There's also a question over, whether or not we really are phasing those out completely. And we've just heard in the last week the International Energy Agency, which is the world's premier institution on these matters, certainly not affiliated with climate activism in any way, but reiterating their conclusion that if we're going to stay within that safe climate threshold of 1.5 degrees, that there isn't room for new oil and gas projects. And that's really going to be at the heart of a lot of what's being discussed.
And Adam, who are the key players going to be? Presidents Biden and Xi aren't going to be there.
Yeah, they're not going to be there, but there are more than 100 heads of state heading out there. They include Rishi Sunak, they include Modi for India, De Silva for Brazil. So there's going to be real key players there. In terms of the personnel, people to look for will include at the opening ceremony on Friday, there'll be this sort of trio of King Charles, there'll be MBZ, the head of the UAE, and there'll be Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General. So those are some of the key people. Obviously, at these talks, as per previous ones, the big players that really matter are the US and China, and the EU are the sort of big blocs that really have the power. That said, the importance of these talks is that your Palaus and your Malawis also get a seat at the table, and their voices also get heard. And this is, you've got to remember, this is a consensus-based process. So those smaller countries do have a chance to make their voice heard.
And Tessa, from Paris 2015, which was famously quoted before COP26, the world was looking to a warming target of 1.5 degrees. Recent reports suggesting it's 2.9 degrees. Can you give us an idea of what that ultimately is going to mean in the future if that difference remains?
Well, 2.9 degrees of warming would be catastrophic. I mean, already at about 1.2 degrees of warming, as I mentioned, we're seeing unprecedented heat waves, flooding, wildfires, marine heat waves as well across the North Atlantic, for example. So this is just a taste of what is going to come. At 1.5 degrees, even if we were to manage to limit warming to that threshold, you end up saying goodbye to the vast majority of the world's coral reefs. And, of course, we want to preserve those for biodiversity, to protect and restore our ocean ecosystems. But our coral reefs also are a major driver of food security and economic development for hundreds of millions of people across the world. And we would lose that in a 1.5 degree world. So to think then about a 2.9 degree world, I mean, you can certainly see sea level rise, for example, that would threaten a lot of coastal nations, especially the more vulnerable ones in Asia, small island states. They don't have a hope really of survival.
Tessa, Adam, thank you both for joining us in Scotland tonight.